Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into an absolutely beautiful memoir to uncover how our early romantic relationships actually serve as profound vehicles for self-discovery and spiritual awakening. We're going to be looking at a story that completely reframes how we think about youthful romance, so let's just jump right in. Right off the bat, the author hits us with this incredible thought. First loves are not meant to last. They are meant to awaken. And, this immediately establishes our core theme for today. It challenges us to completely shift our perspective. A first love isn't just a mere romantic milestone or a box to check off in our youth. Instead, it's an essential, often intense catalyst for our inner maturity. So, let's explore how that happens in part one, the search for sacred love. To really get where the author is coming from, we have to look at his starting point. There was this stark contrast between his worldview and that of his peers. His high school buddies, they viewed intimacy pretty superficially. They judged appearances, mocked people, and essentially treated intimacy like a trophy to be won. But the author, he carried this innate, lonely calling for a deeper, sacred connection. He knew life and love were sacred, and that knowing God wasn't just some 1 hour a week Sunday event, but a literal moment-by-moment affair. Because of this massive gap in perspective, he felt entirely isolated in the quiet corridors of his youth. It wasn't a lack of romance. It was his soul calling out for something more. Which brings us to part two, guided by destiny and intuition. That search for deeper meaning finally paid off when he stepped way outside of his usual world. He traveled down to an ashram in Mexico City, and that is where he met Anna. She was this bright, warm, and deeply spiritual Irish soul who operated on his exact wavelength. And from there, an incredible, almost cinematic journey unfolded. After meeting in Mexico City, they traveled to Guatemala, where the author realized a 10-year-old boy traveling with a parrot already understood life way better than most adults. They met the remarkable Mayan people, whose ancient calendars were so advanced they made our Gregorian calendar look primitive. From there, the timeline traces back up to Machinchen Bay in Mexico, and then all the way north to British Columbia, Canada. But here's the crazy part. The crucial detail wasn't just the miles they logged, but the invisible force guiding them, intuition. It was a deep, unexplainable knowing, and this wasn't just some vague feeling for them either. While walking near Machinchen Bay, they both suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to turn around. They couldn't explain it, they just knew. Moments later, a bullet whizzed right past them, close enough to actually hear. And later on in Canada, they accepted a ride home and ended up being buried in a deadly avalanche by exactly 30 seconds. Destiny and intuition were quite literally acting as their shield. You can imagine that through these intense, shared experiences, their bond just skyrocketed. It grew so deep, in fact, that they planned to marry. Honoring her roots, the author actually followed traditional Irish custom, traveling all the way to ask Anna's father for her hand. It was a really beautiful testament to the respect and gravity they placed on their connection. Eventually, though, all those grand adventures distilled into this beautiful, magical simplicity. Settling in British Columbia brought them a totally different kind of quiet joy. They stayed at the home of Dr. Michael Claper, a real health pioneer. They spent their days cooking Indian meals for Canadian Thanksgiving, learning how to perfectly puff chapatis in the oven from a kind friend named Bill Patterson, and taking peaceful, quiet walks together through the falling snow in White Rock. Life was simple, and life was incredibly beautiful. Now we hit a turning point. In part three, happiness must come from within. Look, relationships constantly evolve, right? And when Anna eventually moved to Nelson, British Columbia, the author felt completely lost. He just hadn't yet developed the maturity to stand alone. But that pain led directly to a profound realization. You cannot place your joy in another person. Nobody can fill you up. True happiness and joy absolutely cannot be outsourced to a partner. It is something that must be cultivated internally. Even despite the shifting dynamics of their relationship and the pain of evolving apart, they still managed to share these perfect, sensory-rich moments in Nelson. The author spent 6 months there just soaking in the deep magic of the area. They relaxed in natural hot springs. The author saw fireflies for the very first time, marveling as they flashed like tiny stars in the night. And they shared an amazing 3-day adventure on Kootenay Lake, surrounded by crystal water and mountains, simply eating French bread and brie cheese with a little white wine. Ultimately, their physical paths definitively diverged as they pursued their own necessary internal growth. The author felt called to move to Santa Fe, New Mexico to study at an Academy of Natural Healing. Anna's path? That took her all the way across the country to Gainesville, Florida. They would end up meeting briefly in California a year later to share cold homemade gazpacho with his parents, and then they shared one final goodbye over wonton soup in a Chinese restaurant in Miami over 30 years ago. And that brings us to part 4, the first mirror. So what does this all mean in the grand scheme of the author's life? We'll call this the Ledger of Anna. It's essentially a rapid-fire summary of her spiritual curriculum. Look at these takeaways. Love is sacred. Intuition is undeniably real. Happiness must come from within. Relationships will always evolve. Adventure reveals our deepest truths. Letting go is just a part of life. And finally, gratitude lasts forever. You see, heartbreak isn't just pain, it teaches maturity. Anna was placed in his life to reveal his own innocence and guide him toward his true self. Ultimately, this whole journey shows us that our early romantic partners act as mirrors. They reflect our own internal state back to us. She wasn't just a girlfriend, she was the very first teacher of the heart, teaching the author the vital, life-altering difference between mere longing and actual sacred love. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to take a second and really reflect on your own life. Think about your past relationships, your heartbreaks, and your own internal joy. Looking back at the people who shaped you, who was your first mirror?